You'll never guess what I'm holding.
Tickets.
Tickets. Everyone's story of how they got into fishing is different, each with their ups and downs, and mine's no different, although I've had to think long and hard about how and when I wanted to share it, as the title of this video isn't clickbait. This is my story, and I suppose it's probably best to start at the beginning. It wasn't actually all that long ago since I started fishing, but the way that I first got into it, I think was probably a little bit different than most. From what I've heard, I think most people start out by float fishing with their dad as a kid, but not me. At the ripe old age of 22, my now father-in-law asked me if I wanted to join him on a fishing trip to Belgium, and for some strange reason, I decided to say yes. Before I knew it, I was given a crash course in carp fishing. I'd never even held a rod before, but there I was learning different rigs, how to cast, and little by little, I started to understand some of the basics behind fishing. So I've just finished setting up my dudes. This is dude 1. Dude 2 is around here. We're using quite a large bait, so hopefully only a carp will want to pick it up. It didn't take long before I saw my first fish of the trip. Hugh had caught a bream, which was probably one of the biggest fish I'd ever seen in my life. We spent the rest of the day chilling out, and eventually crawling into bed, I became nervous of what the night could bring. So last night I caught my first ever fish. He was a bream and I named him Larry. Got him in the net and then didn't have a clue what to do next. I can imagine how big and how heavy a big carp would be. I'd actually caught something. I wasn't sure that I'd loved the experience, but it had made me curious as to what it would feel like to catch something bigger. We spent a lot of the days thereafter walking the stretches of canal, looking for signs of fish, ate a lot of good food, but before we knew it, we were facing the end of our trip without so much as a sniff of our target species. On Hugh's last trip to Belgium, he'd made a local friend called Luke, who is quite possibly one of the most lovely and generous men I've ever met. Luke had access to a very special lake, and knowing we were struggling, had kindly invited us to come and fish with him for our last night. Before I knew it, I was on a boat for the very first time, nervously excited whilst being told stories of giant carp that had been caught there over the last few years. So we've just arrived at a swim. Hugh is there, laying the rods out, and then bringing them back in the boat. And there's some big fish here. I don't have a lot of footage for what happened next, as what I can only describe as pure carnage unfolded. In the space of 12 hours, Hugh broke his personal best twice. First with a 34-pound common, followed by another in the night at 49 pounds. Oh my god. I don't think either of us slept a wink that night. The adrenaline and excitement was just too much. I'd loved every second of watching Hugh catch, but now it was my turn on the rods, and come the morning, they erupted into life. Suddenly I was connected to 44 pounds of Belgium gold, a truly absurd fish to call my first ever carp. I'd also managed to set the boat loose, which Hugh hilariously had to swim after, but it all added to the moment, and if you'll excuse the pun, I was hooked for life. It took fishing a couple of day tickets back home to realise just how special the fish in Belgium had been, and whilst it had been an incredible shared experience, I hadn't really earned it like Hugh had. I'd simply reeled in a fish off the back of his and Luke's tactics, and whilst that didn't make it any less special, it had made me realise that I now had the desire to catch something big and impressive on my own. I quickly started researching and found some amazing lakes very close to where I lived at the time, but it was at this point that COVID struck.
You must stay at home.
You know the drill. Stuck indoors, excessive facial hair and 1 hour of exercise each day. Although, luckily for me, that meant walking to a nearby lake where I could watch the sunrise and, more importantly, search for signs of carp. It didn't take long before I was completely smitten with the place, and it was probably spending time there that kept me sane. I quickly found out that it was owned by a local fishing club, and despite not knowing when restrictions would ease, I decided to apply and see if they'd let me in. You'll never guess what I'm holding.
Tickets.
Tickets. Although I had got into the club, fishing the lake of my dreams would have to wait for the following year, as new members could only go on certain lakes. That said, the alternative wasn't exactly a downgrade. 100 acres of glacial water, a mystery stock of fish, and swims that you could only reach by boat. The adventurer in me loved it, but the best part was that Hugh had managed to get a ticket too. So, upon lockdown easing, we both got straight down there for our first session.
Oh, you are taking piss.
What's happened to you? I f***ed up. And so it all began. I didn't have a lot of spare money for bait, so taught myself how to cook my own. I found spots and tried my luck, which never seemed to go that well, but I remained hopeful.
Brilliant session over the past 2 nights with you. No fish, but lots of learning, especially for me. I can now do boat things.
That's the end of session 6, 5, I don't know. Caught nothing.
So, session number... Forgot, but I've lost track now. Doesn't really matter anymore, does it?
In hindsight, the fishing on there was utterly brutal, but it never really felt like that. Every session was a huge adventure, and little by little, I did feel like I was heading in the right direction.
Good morning. Turned up at about 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, and didn't realise it'd be so dark. Hugh put a candle out on the end of the planks for me to try and find my way. And then I've woken up this morning and I'm watching fish roll over where my bait is. So we'll see.
I gave the glacial lake a year of my life, and in return it taught me how to fish whatever the weather, how to cook a lot of good food, and it was there that I asked Hugh if I could marry his daughter. I have so many incredible memories, just none that involved any fish.
I blanked for 40 nights that year, and I can say it was painful, and I worked so hard, and I did, but ultimately I was just learning, and I was loving every second of that. I was chasing the carp around this massive lake, trying to look for shows, bait them into certain areas, and it was fantastic. I got close on a couple of occasions, but ultimately I was able to take all of that learning with me when I was offered a ticket on the Dream Lake.
I'd fished this lake so many times in my head, but after a handful of short sessions, I quickly realised that I couldn't cast where I'd seen the fish jumping back in lockdown. It was just too far for my ability and the rods I had at the time, and so I decided to create a spot of my own in the near margin instead. I began cooking up as much bait as my tiny flat would handle. I picked the grottiest swim on the lake in order to avoid the other anglers, and decided that I would pre-bait for at least a month before fishing it. Eventually, I felt like it was time and got down to the lake for my first proper go. I was so nervous and excited, and it really didn't take me very long to get all 3 rods out, but I did feel confident that I could leave them be for the duration of the session. Just as I'd finished setting up, it started raining, gently at first, but soon the heavens well and truly opened, slowly flooding my bivvy to the point that I had to dig a channel to encourage the water to leave. Disappointingly, I slept well that night. Not a single indication from any of my alarms, but I decided to keep the rods in place for just a little longer, as I felt like there was still a chance. I was halfway through making my morning coffee when I realised that that was the correct decision, as my left-hand rod had burst into life. I picked up into what I immediately recognised as the pull of a seriously big fish, fighting even harder than the one in Belgium. I remember every second of that moment, the smell of the summer rain in the air, and eventually I got it into the net. I peered in and accidentally let out a shout of excitement as I'd gone and caught 42 pounds of the type of carp that dreams are made of. Even to this day, I don't think I've ever caught anything that has even come close to just how spectacular that fish was. I slipped it back to the water and, still shaking from the excitement, sent photos to friends I'd made within the club as they had with me, and for a moment I was on top of the world.
So this is the part of the story where I guess things took a turn for the worst, and I've tried to record this a couple of times, and it's quite difficult to thread all my sentences together, so I'm sorry if this is a bit bitty, but I'll try my best. I got back to the lake and I was excited. I'd got some more food, some more bait from the tackle shop, and I ran down to my swim, put my rucksack down and my bucket to reserve it or whatever, went back up to the car park and started unloading onto my barrow when a guy came over to me and said, "Are you Tom?" To which I replied, "Yep, that's me." And he then said, "I think you should probably start loading your car back up. I don't think you're going to be able to fish here today." I asked why. I was confused, and he said he couldn't talk to me, that he needed to make a call, and somebody would come down and have a chat with me. So I did as I was told, and I started packing my car, despite not really understanding why. And eventually a van pulls up, a guy jumps out with a brown hoodie that says bailiff with a lanyard and credentials, and he walks over and explains to me that I had been banned from the club, from all of the waters around my hometown, and I tried to, and the reason why was I'd broken the publicity ban. He showed me the photo that I'd taken not more than 24 hours ago of me with the fish. He'd been sent it by somebody, and he said, "Yeah, you've broken the publicity ban. This is one of the rules that we take most seriously. Give me a ticket, you're banned, mate." So I tried to plead and apologise and say, you know, I'm pretty new to fishing. I'm still learning all of this stuff. I don't know the etiquette necessarily, but he didn't have any of it, and I gave him my ticket, and I'm not too ashamed to say that I cried all the way on the drive back home, which I'm sure I'm going to get a comment saying, "It's just fishing, mate, don't be so emotional." But these places had come to mean everything to me. The joy I'd experienced of trying to work it out over the past 2 years, I'd loved every second of it, and all of a sudden I couldn't do that anymore, and I basically gave up fishing for 6 or 7 months thereafter. I wrote to the club asking for an appeal, for a meeting, for me to come and basically beg to have my ticket given back to me, but I never heard back from them, and eventually I did receive a letter saying that they had had a chat and believed that a 6-month ban was sufficient. Those 6 months were all of the best part of the fishing season, but that's by the by. And anyway, I did get my ticket back, and I immediately signed up for work parties, which is where you help out around the lake and try and make it better for the anglers doing work. You probably know what I'm talking about. And I went there to try and get back in the good books of the club members, but nobody would talk to me. It was very, very obvious that I kind of wasn't welcome anymore. And I tried to fish there a couple more times before realizing that my heart just wasn't in it anymore, and that these places that were once little slices of heaven for me were just filled with too much upset, and yeah, I dropped the ticket the next year, and I've not been back since.
I don't really blame the club for what happened. I know they were just trying to protect their water, but what happened did affect me for a long time, and it's only been in making this video that I've really been able to let go of it. In the years that followed, I rekindled my love for fishing by doing so with my family. I helped my dad catch his first carp, the same with my brother, and all these years later, I finally allowed myself to fall in love with another lake. Somewhere I'm free to fish and film to my heart's content, and I can now say for certain, the best is yet to come.